This is the introduction to Unit 5, land and water use. We're going to start with some land use concepts, specifically the tragedy of the commons. So the idea is that if there is a common resource, and in this case it's imagined as a field, if people are allowed to use that, they'll use as much as they can get because it is a common resource. They don't really have any incentive not to use it. But if everybody does that, then the resource is depleted. So that the idea is that there's some sustainable use. In this case, we could call that the carrying capacity, where some number of animals, in this example, 20 cows, could use the field indefinitely. But if you go over that, even if it's just that 21st cow, the resource will become depleted, and then nobody can use it. And so that's why it's called the tragedy, that this common area could be overused and then become useless. And so this concept, we apply that to most of the environmental systems that we look at, the atmosphere, the ocean, the land. And we will talk about where this idea came from, some of the issues that the author had, but the concept of the tragedy of the commons remains. In general, environmental assets are considered externalities. And what I mean by this is that there's a cost to polluting the atmosphere or the water or the soil. And often that cost is not included in the price of a good. I mean, literally, I mean the cost, like the money that something costs. Now, there can be both positive or negative externalities. In this example, the smell of bread is a positive externality, if you like bread, of course. But a similar smell, like air pollution from a factory, would be considered a negative externality. Like neither of those things are included in the price of their good, and yet they still exist, and we have to account for them some way. Now, a common thought for avoiding the tragedy of the commons is private ownership. Right? If the commons was privately owned instead of commonly owned, then farmers would have an incentive not to overgraze the land. Regulation is also possible, right? If the government comes in and sets limits on the number of cows that can be in that pasture, that's another way to avoid the tragedy of the commons. So the issue with the tragedy of the commons is not so much the idea of overuse of a shared resource, but that the person who created who wrote the original article was actually quite racist. Promoted eugenics, nativist, anti-Islamic, major problems, and he used the idea of the tragedy of the commons to, put forth and support some of these, ideas that he had, and so he took this basic idea, which is, pretty fundamental to the use of common resource, but then used it to try to justify all kinds of terrible things. So it's important to understand that although tragedy of the commons is important to our understanding of how environmental issues work, the origins of the tragedy of the commons has some problems. In order to discuss some of the agriculture and forestry that we're going to discuss for parts of land and water use, it's important to understand different categories of public lands that exist. Again, we're talking about public lands, not privately owned lands. And so these are different categories that exist internationally. And then we'll talk about some in the US. So the first is national parks. This is a picture of Zion National Park in Utah. I've been there. It is absolutely beautiful. National parks have scientific, educational, recreational purposes, and 2.7% of the Earth's area are considered national parks. At least in the US, there's no extraction of resources here. And so positive externalities of the national parks, conservation, tourism, but especially in the US, a number of indigenous people have been displaced by this, and that's not included in, our costing of the parks. They're managed resource protected areas, so technically these aren't parks, but governments manage biological, mineral, and recreational resources in these areas. You might consider national forest to be a managed resource protection area. There are also habitat and species management areas where specific interventions are made to maintain certain biological communities. You could consider this things like fire prevention for plants or predator control for animals. There are also nature reserves and wilderness areas, and so these exist to protect specific species and ecosystems. Also, landscapes and seascapes. So we try to use these natural resources non-destructively, primarily for tourism and recreation. So often you'll see things like beaches or orchards that are protected, occasionally a village. Finally, there are national monuments. These types of monuments have cultural interest, right? Mount Rushmore or Taj Mahal. There's about 20,000 of them. St. Louis Arch, Arc de Triomphe, that statue in Rio de Janeiro, right? These are all considered national monuments. In the US, public lands are the largest area in the US. Technically, the federal government is the country's largest landowner. 25% of the country includes rangelands, national forests, national parks, national wildlife refuges, and finally just wilderness areas. And this is much more common out west. If you look at percentages of land in each state that are considered federal land, you can see everything basically in the Rockies, and west of the Rockies. Significantly high percentages of federal land. Basically, when you're out on the federal land, you can kind of just explore to your heart's content. There's not really police or anything out there. So you got to be careful too. All right, so that's our introduction to public land and land and water use. Please let me know what questions you have.